spring 1945, across 1,000 prisoner-of-war camps scattered through the American heartland, the same ritual unfolded each morning: roll call, breakfast, work assignments. But on one particular April day, at a compound outside Salina, Kansas, something different happened. The guards arrived carrying wooden crates filled not with tools or rations but with paper and pens. The German women standing in formation stiffened as officers moved down the lines, placing a single sheet of white paper and a fountain pen into each prisoner's hands. The items felt strange, almost sacred: smooth paper that had not been rationed, pens with real ink that flowed without scratching. One woman from Dresden whispered to her neighbor, "They want confessions. They will make us write our crimes." Her companion, a former telephone operator named Clara Weber, gripped the pen so tightly her knuckles went white. She had seen interrogation rooms in the final chaotic weeks of the Reich's collapse. She had heard stories of forced statements, signatures extracted under threat, documents used to condemn entire families. The paper in her hand felt less like a gift and more like a trap waiting to close. An American lieutenant stepped forward, his boots crunching on the gravel of the compound yard. Through a translator, a middle-aged woman from Wisconsin who spoke careful German, he announced, "You will write letters to your families. The Red Cross will deliver them. Write whatever you wish. No one will read them except those you address." The words hung in the air like smoke. Write whatever you wish. The women exchanged glances, searching each other's faces for understanding. This had to be a trick. No captor handed prisoners paper and promised privacy. No enemy offered connection to home without conditions. But the lieutenant was already walking away, and the translator was explaining the process. Address lines, length limits, the International Red Cross postal system. Her voice was matter-of-fact, almost bored, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Clara stared at the blank sheet in her hands and felt her throat tighten. If this was real, if she could truly send word to her mother in Hamburg, then she would have to write the impossible. She would have to explain that she was alive, that she was safe, that the enemy was feeding her 3 meals a day while her mother scraped by on ration cards that bought less each week. How do you write such a letter? How do you tell your family that captivity has made you healthier than freedom ever did? Clara Weber was 28 years old, though the last 3 years of war had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time. She had worked as a telephone switchboard operator for the Wehrmacht Communication Corps in France, routing calls between command posts, listening to voices that grew more desperate as the Allied advance pushed deeper into occupied territory. When the collapse came in March 1945, she had been swept up with hundreds of other auxiliaries, women in gray-green uniforms who had never fired a weapon, but had served the military machine nonetheless. They were sorted, documented, tagged with numbers, and shipped across an ocean to a country that existed in her mind only as enemy propaganda, a land of gangsters and racial chaos, of cities built on greed and violence. The reality of Kansas had shattered those images in ways she still struggled to process. Endless flat horizons, wheat fields stretching to meet impossible skies, small towns where churches and schools stood intact, untouched by bombs, surrounded by houses with painted shutters and gardens blooming with flowers. No one had eaten out of desperation. The camp itself was orderly to the point of unsettling. Barracks arranged in neat rows, latrines that were cleaned daily, a mess hall that served oatmeal, bread, sometimes eggs. The portions were not generous, but they were consistent. No one went hungry. No one fought over scraps. In Hamburg, her mother's letters reported, people traded family heirlooms for potatoes. Children fainted in bread lines. The city was a landscape of rubble, where survivors lived in cellars beneath buildings that no longer had roofs. Clara had not heard from her mother in 4 months. The last letter, forwarded through chaos and censors, had been written in January. It described cold so severe that ice formed inside their makeshift shelter, and food so scarce that her mother boiled potato peels 3 times to extract every trace of nutrition. Now, standing in the Kansas sunlight with paper and pen in her hands, Clara had the chance to send word back, to tell her mother she had survived, to offer some small comfort in a world that had offered so little. But what could she possibly say? The women had been prepared for interrogation, not correspondence. During the final months of the war, as the Reich crumbled and the Allies closed in from all sides, Wehrmacht officers had briefed auxiliaries on what to expect if captured. The instructions were clear: give only name, rank, and service number. Reveal nothing about operations, nothing about locations, nothing that could be used against Germany. But more than that, they had been warned about American psychological tactics. The enemy, they were told, would offer false kindness to extract information. They would promise to deliver letters and then use the contents to identify resistance networks, to locate family members, to build cases for war crimes trials. One propaganda film Clara had watched in a crowded cinema in Normandy showed dramatized scenes of American interrogators reading prisoner letters aloud, laughing at expressions of love and longing, using the words against captured soldiers. The message was unmistakable. Trust nothing the Americans offer. Every gesture of humanity is a weapon in disguise. So when the paper and pens appeared, many women assumed this was exactly that, a clever trap dressed as mercy. Write your heart onto paper, and they will use it to destroy you. A nurse from Berlin named Margaret refused to take her sheet at all. She told the guard through clenched teeth that she would write nothing, confess nothing, cooperate with no American trick. The guard, a young private from Iowa who barely understood German, simply shrugged and moved on. He left the paper and pen on her bunk anyway. The journey that had brought Clara to Kansas had begun in chaos. She remembered the last days in France with the clarity of nightmare. Roads clogged with retreating soldiers, supply depots burning, civilians fleeing in every direction. Her communication unit had abandoned their equipment and tried to reach the German border on foot, walking through nights lit by distant artillery fire. They were captured near Metz by American infantry, a column of exhausted women who surrendered without resistance because resistance was no longer possible. The soldiers who took them were neither cruel nor kind. They were efficient. Names recorded, possessions searched, weapons collected, though none of the women carried any. Then came the holding camps, sprawling tent cities where thousands of prisoners waited in mud while the Allies processed paperwork and arranged transport. Clara spent 2 weeks in one such camp, sleeping on the ground, eating from tin bowls, watching German soldiers, some still teenagers, sit in stunned silence as the war they had believed in dissolved around them. The Atlantic crossing had been worse than the capture. 17 days below deck in a converted cargo ship, the steel walls sweating condensation, the air thick with diesel fumes and the sharp smell of too many bodies in too little space. Women prayed in whispers, vomited into buckets, clutched photographs of children and parents they might never see again. Clara kept a small photograph of her mother tucked inside her uniform jacket, a formal portrait from 1938, before the war, when her mother's face still held the roundness of regular meals, and her eyes had not yet learned the permanent squint of hunger. During the crossing, Clara would take out that photograph in the dim light and trace her mother's features with her fingertip, trying to memorize them in case memory was all she would have left. When the ship docked in New York, the women were marched through a processing center that felt more like a factory than a prison. Medical examinations, delousing stations, new uniforms issued, gray cotton dresses stamped PW in black letters. Everything documented, everything recorded in triplicate on forms that disappeared into filing cabinets. Then the train journey inland, through a landscape so vast it seemed impossible. Cities gave way to farmland, farmland to plains, plains to horizons that never seemed to end. America, Clara realized, was a country that had never known invasion, never felt bombs falling on its cities, never watched its children starve in the streets. The contrast was obscene. And now she was being asked to write a letter home, to send word across that vast distance to a mother living in ruins, and somehow explain this strange captivity where the enemy provided beds and meals and paper to write on. Clara kept her own private notebook hidden in the lining of her mattress. She wrote in it at night when the other women slept, using pencil stubs she had saved from work assignments. The entries were fragmented, thoughts captured between exhaustion and the constant fear of discovery. April 8th, 1945. They gave us paper today. Real paper, not the thin gray sheets we used in the communications office that tore if you pressed too hard. This paper is white, smooth, almost luxurious, and pens with ink that flows. I held them in my hands and did not know whether to laugh or weep. For 3 years I routed calls for officers who sent men to die. I listened to voices plan attacks, coordinate retreats, order executions. I was part of the machine, even if I never pulled a trigger. And now the enemy hands me paper and tells me to write to my mother. What do I say? That I am well fed while she starves, that I sleep in a bed while she huddles in a cellar, that the Americans treat me with more care than our own government showed its citizens? How is any of this fair? How do I write truth without breaking her heart? That first afternoon, as the sun climbed high over the Kansas plains and heat shimmered off the gravel yard, the women were given 2 hours to write their letters. They could sit anywhere in the compound, on their bunks, at the mess hall tables, even outside under the guard towers if they wished. Clara chose a spot near the fence line where a small patch of shade offered relief from the sun. She sat cross-legged on the ground, the paper balanced on a book she had been allowed to keep, and stared at the blank whiteness. Around her, other women were beginning to write. Some covered the page quickly, their handwriting cramped and desperate, trying to fit as many words as possible into the space allowed. Others sat frozen, pens hovering above paper, unable to begin. The nurse Margaret, who had refused her paper earlier, finally retrieved it from her bunk and sat nearby. She wrote a single line, then stopped, then another. Then she crumpled the page and started again. Clara watched this from the corner of her eye and understood. Every word was a small betrayal, of expectations, of propaganda, of everything they had been taught to believe. Clara touched the pen to paper and began. "Dearest Mama." The words came slowly at first, each sentence requiring careful consideration. "Dearest Mama, I am alive. I am in America, in a place called Kansas. I am not injured. I am not harmed. Please do not worry." She stopped. Read what she had written. The words felt inadequate, too simple to carry the weight of 4 months of silence. But what else could she say? How could she compress everything, the capture, the ocean crossing, the strange reality of captivity, into a single sheet of paper? She continued, her handwriting growing smaller as she tried to fit more. "We are in a camp with other women. There are many of us here. The Americans have given us places to sleep and food to eat. I know this must sound strange. I know you have heard terrible things about American camps, but I must tell you the truth as I have lived it. They do not beat us. They do not starve us. Each morning we receive oatmeal and bread. At midday there is soup or stew. In the evening more bread and sometimes meat. I have gained weight, Mama. My hands no longer shake from hunger." She paused again, reading those last sentences with something close to shame. How would her mother receive these words? Would she feel relief that her daughter was safe? Or would she feel the bitter irony that captivity had become sustenance? "I think of you every day. I imagine you in the cellar of our building, wrapped in the old quilt grandmother made, reading by candlelight. I pray that you have enough to eat, that the cold is not too severe, that you are not alone. I wish I could send you food, but they do not allow packages, only letters." Her pen hovered over the paper. There was so much more she wanted to say, about the vastness of this country, about the strangeness of being fed by enemies, about the quiet kindness of certain guards who smiled when they thought no one was watching. But the space was limited, and her courage more limited still. "I will write again when they allow it. Please write back if you can. Tell me you are well. Tell me you remember me. I remain your daughter, no matter the ocean between us. With all my love, Clara." She set down the pen and stared at what she had written. The letter felt both too much and not enough, a glimpse of truth that could never capture the whole. An hour later, the translator from Wisconsin moved through the compound collecting the completed letters. She carried a large canvas sack and checked each envelope against a roster on her clipboard. "Address must be complete," she reminded the women in careful German. "Street, city, postal district if you know it. The Red Cross will try to deliver them, but if the address is unclear or if the area is now occupied by Soviet forces, they may not reach their destination." Soviet forces. The word sent a chill through the assembled women. Germany had been divided by the victors, carved into zones of occupation. Letters sent to the eastern regions, to Berlin, Dresden, cities now under Soviet control, might never arrive at all. Clara's mother was in Hamburg, in the British zone. There was a chance. Not certainty, but a chance. She watched as the translator placed her letter into the sack along with dozens of others. The woman handled each envelope with professional care, as if they were documents of importance rather than desperate scraps of communication from defeated enemies. "How long?" one woman asked. "How long until they arrive?" The translator considered. "If the postal systems are functioning and the Red Cross can make their deliveries, perhaps 6 weeks, perhaps longer. The infrastructure in Germany is damaged." Damaged. Such a mild word for the destruction they all knew awaited. But the translator's tone was not cruel. She stated facts without pleasure, without condemnation. After she left with the bag of letters, Margaret the nurse sat down beside Clara on the ground. Her face was drawn, her eyes red from crying she had tried to hide. "I wrote to my sister," she said quietly. "I do not even know if she is alive. Our neighborhood was bombed in February. But I wrote anyway because what else can I do?" Clara nodded. What else could any of them do but reach across the distance and hope their words found their targets? The days after sending the letters were strange. The women moved through their routines, roll call, work details in the camp laundry or kitchen, meals in the mess hall. But something had shifted. They had sent pieces of themselves out into the world, and now they waited to see if anything would come back. Some women became obsessed with mail call, the daily ritual when the camp postal clerk would stand in the yard and read names from arriving letters. Those early weeks, there were no responses. The letters sent from Kansas had not yet had time to reach Germany, much less generate replies. But occasionally, letters arrived from other sources, from German families who had been searching for missing daughters and had somehow gotten word to the Red Cross, or from German prisoners in other camps who had heard through the network that someone they knew was at Salina. Each name called out was met with a sharp intake of breath from dozens of women hoping to hear their own. Those who received letters would retreat to quiet corners to read, their faces cycling through emotions too complex to name. Joy at contact, grief at news of loss, confusion at descriptions of conditions at home that seemed impossible to endure. Clara received nothing for 6 weeks. She told herself this was expected, that postal systems took time, that her mother might not even know where to send a reply. But the waiting hollowed her out in ways the captivity itself had not. To fill the days, the women worked. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners of war be given meaningful activity, and the camp administrators assigned them to various labor details based on their skills and the camp's needs. Clara, with her communications background, was assigned to the camp administrative office. She sorted files, organized records, helped translate documents from German to English when needed. The work was clerical, quiet, and gave her access to something she had not expected. A glimpse into how the American military operated. The office where she worked was orderly almost to the point of obsession. Every document filed in its proper place, every form completed in triplicate, every prisoner's record maintained with meticulous care. The sergeant who supervised her, a man named Patterson from Pennsylvania, treated paperwork with the same seriousness some soldiers treated weapons. One afternoon, while filing correspondence, Clara came across the Red Cross postal logs, thick ledgers that tracked every letter sent from the camp and every letter received. She saw her own name listed, Weber, Clara. Letter dispatched 8 April 1945. Destination, Hamburg, British occupation zone. Status, in transit, in transit. 2 words that meant her letter was somewhere between Kansas and Hamburg, passing through postal channels she could only imagine, carried by people she would never meet, crossing an ocean on faith that systems designed during peace could still function in the aftermath of total war. She also saw numbers that staggered her. In the past month alone, this single camp had processed over 800 letters from German prisoners to families in Europe, and had received nearly 200 replies. Across all the American POW camps, and there were over 500 of them scattered across the continent, tens of thousands of letters were moving through this same system every month. It was logistics on a scale she had only seen in military operations, except this time, the logistics served connection rather than destruction. Diary entry. April 29th, 1945. Hitler is dead. We heard the news today. Some women wept, others stared in silence. A few seemed almost relieved, as if his death finally gave them permission to stop believing in something that had stopped being real months ago. I felt numb. What does it matter now? The war is over, or ending, or collapsing, depending on which report you believe. Germany exists only in fragments. And I sit in Kansas filing papers for the American Army, part of a system that tracks letters from prisoners to families, as if this were the most important work in the world. Perhaps it is. Perhaps in the wreckage of everything, the ability to tell someone you are alive is the only victory that matters. But I have not heard from Mama. 6 weeks since I wrote. No reply. I check the mail log every day, running my finger down the columns of names, looking for mine. It is never there. On May 12th, 53 days after she had sent her letter, Clara's name was called at mail call. She almost didn't hear it. She had stopped attending the daily ritual, unable to bear the disappointment of hearing other names but never her own. But that afternoon, Margaret came running to the laundry where Clara was working and grabbed her arm. "They called your name," she said breathlessly. "Mail call. There's a letter." Clara's hands, wet from washing, began to shake. She dried them on her dress and walked across the compound to where the postal clerk still stood with his remaining envelopes. He handed her a thin envelope, the paper soft from handling, the address written in handwriting she recognized instantly. Her mother's neat, careful script. She carried the letter back to her bunk, sat on the edge of the mattress, and held it for a long moment before opening it. This fragile piece of paper had traveled from Hamburg to Kansas, had crossed an ocean and a continent, had survived postal systems barely functioning in a defeated nation, and now sat in her hands like something almost holy. She opened it carefully, afraid the paper might tear. The letter was dated March 28th, written 2 weeks before Clara's own letter could possibly have arrived in Hamburg. Her mother had not known where she was, whether she was alive, or if she would ever receive this desperate message thrown into the void of war's end. My dearest Clara, I do not know if this will reach you. I do not know if you can read it. I do not even know if you still live, but the Red Cross has told me they will try to forward mail to prisoners in American camps, so I write in hope. The city is unrecognizable. Our street is gone. The building where you grew up is rubble. I live now in the cellar of what was the Hoffman Pharmacy. There are 11 of us in this space meant for storing medicine. We share one blanket. We boil snow for water. Your Aunt Gerda died in February from cold. Your cousin Emil has not been seen since January. I tell you these things not to burden you, but because you deserve truth. We survive. That is the most I can say. I wake each morning surprised that my heart still beats. The British soldiers who occupy our sector are not cruel. They give us ration cards. Sometimes there is bread. More often there is nothing to buy with the cards. I have sold everything we owned except your grandmother's wedding ring. I cannot bring myself to part with it. It is the last thing of value, and I keep it hidden in my shoe. I think of you constantly. I dream that you are somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere the war has not devoured everything. I pray to a God I am no longer sure exists, that you will come home. If you receive this, please write. Tell me you live. That is all I need to know. Your mother. Clara read the letter 3 times. The first time, tears blurred the words. The second time, her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the paper. The third time, she read it aloud in a whisper, as if speaking the words might make the distance between Kansas and Hamburg smaller. Her mother had written this before receiving Clara's letter, before knowing that her daughter was alive, safe, fed. The desperation in every line was unbearable. And now Clara had to write back. Had to explain that while her mother sold everything to survive, while her aunt died of cold and her cousin vanished, she had been eating oatmeal and sleeping under wool blankets in an American camp, where the worst hardship was boredom. How do you write such a letter without it sounding like mockery? That evening, the camp administrator announced that prisoners would be permitted to write another round of letters. The Red Cross postal system was functioning better than expected, he explained through the translator, and they were encouraging regular correspondence. Clara sat at the mess hall table with fresh paper and a pen that still felt like a luxury. Around her, other women who had received letters were also writing replies, their faces reflecting the same complicated emotions: relief, guilt, grief, hope tangled together in ways that made simple words impossible. She began carefully. Dearest Mama, your letter reached me today. I wept when I read it. I wept because you are alive. I wept because of all you have endured. I wept because I am here, safe, while you suffer. I received your letter dated March 28th. By now you will have received mine from April, and you will know that I am in America, in a place called Kansas. I am well. I must tell you this even though I know how strange it will sound against the reality you describe. The Americans feed us. They house us. They allow us to write letters and receive them. I work in an office filing papers. It is quiet work. No one harms me. I know what you have heard about American camps. I know what the propaganda said. But I must tell you what I have seen with my own eyes. There is order here. There is food. There is something that looks almost like mercy, though I hesitate to use that word because mercy suggests generosity, and what I see feels more like efficiency. They treat us well because it serves them to do so. But the result is the same. We are alive. We are fed. We are human beings rather than numbers waiting to die. She paused, reading what she had written. It felt defensive, as if she were justifying her survival. She crossed out the last 2 sentences and started again. Mama, I wish I could send you food. I wish I could send you the blanket from my bunk, the bread from breakfast, the warmth of this spring evening. But all I can send are words, and words feel so inadequate. Please tell me what you need. If there is any way the Red Cross can help, I will ask. Please tell me about our neighbors, about anyone who remains. Please tell me you are eating something, anything. I will write every week if they allow it. I will keep writing until this war ends properly and we can be in the same room again. You are not alone. even though an ocean separates us. Every word you write reminds me why I survived. Your daughter Clara. Over the following months, as spring turned to summer and the war in Europe officially ended, the letters became a lifeline in both directions. Clara learned through her work in the administrative office that the International Red Cross postal system was one of the largest civilian operations of the war. Thousands of volunteers in Switzerland, in neutral Sweden, in occupied Germany, sorted and forwarded millions of pieces of mail between prisoners and their families. Each letter was logged, tracked, and delivered when possible. When delivery was impossible, because addresses no longer existed, because families had been displaced, because entire cities had been erased, the letters were held in Red Cross warehouses in Geneva, waiting for someone to come looking. The system was not perfect. Letters were lost, delayed, sometimes destroyed by continuing violence in unstable regions. But it functioned far better than anyone had expected in the chaos of war's end. Through this system, Clara and her mother established a rhythm. Clara would write every Sunday evening, filling both sides of the paper with descriptions of camp life, questions about home, expressions of love wrapped in practical details. Her mother would reply when paper and postal access allowed, her letters arriving every 3 to 4 weeks, each one a small miracle. Through these letters, Clara watched Hamburg rebuild through her mother's eyes. The British occupation authorities began clearing rubble. Food supplies improved slightly. Her mother found work cleaning offices in an administrative building and earned enough to buy a second blanket, small victories in the landscape of loss. And through her mother's words, Clara learned the fates of people she had known. Herr Kessler from the bakery had died during the firebombing. Frau Schmidt had lost both sons on the Eastern Front. The Baumann family had fled to relatives in Bavaria, and no one knew if they had arrived safely. Each letter carried both connection and grief, stitched together in careful handwriting that crossed an ocean. Diary entry. June 15, 1945. Mama writes that she has enough to eat now. Not much, but enough. The British have organized soup kitchens. She says the bread is dark and heavy, nothing like what we had before the war, but it fills the stomach. She is alive. She is eating. She is thinking about the future. These simple facts feel like miracles. I have written 12 letters to her now. She has written 8 to me. I keep them all in a bundle tied with string from the laundry. At night, when I cannot sleep, I reread them. I trace her handwriting with my finger as if I could touch her through the ink. The other women do the same. We have become archivists of our own lives, preserving these fragile connections on paper. Margaret received news that her sister survived the bombing after all. She had been evacuated to the countryside and is living with farmers. Another woman, Erica, learned that her husband is a prisoner in France, also alive. We celebrate these small victories together, but some women receive no letters at all. They write and hear nothing back. The silence is worse than bad news because it offers no closure, only the terrible not knowing. I think of them at mail call, watching names being called that are never theirs, and I feel guilty for the bundle of letters under my mattress. The letters created an unexpected community among the prisoners. Women who received good news would share it quietly with those still waiting. Those who received tragic news would be comforted by others who understood exactly what it meant to lose someone to a war that had already ended. A system developed organically. Women with families in the British zone would share information about conditions there. Those with relatives in the American zone would do the same. The few who had connections to the Soviet zone spoke in whispers about deportations, disappearances, zones sealed off from communication. They began helping each other write letters too. Those with better English would help translate passages that might get past censors more easily. Those with clearer handwriting would transcribe letters for women whose hands shook too badly to write legibly. Those who had received care packages, rare but possible through the Red Cross, would share the contents. Clara found herself writing letters for 2 other women who were illiterate. They would tell her what to say, and she would translate their spoken words into careful script. One woman, a factory worker from Essen named Hilda, dictated a letter to her son who was fighting somewhere in the east when she was captured. She did not know if he was alive, did not know if the letter would ever reach him, but she dictated it anyway. Tell him I am well. Tell him I think of him every hour. Tell him that when this is over, whenever that is, I will find him. Tell him his mother has not forgotten. Clara wrote these words exactly as spoken, and when she finished, Hilda wept and thanked her as if she had performed some great service instead of simply moving a pen across paper. But beneath the relief of communication ran a deeper current of conflict that Clara could not resolve. Every letter she sent home felt like a confession of betrayal. While her mother scrubbed floors in a bombed city for enough money to buy bread, Clara ate 3 meals a day and worked in a climate-controlled office. While her mother slept in a cellar with 10 other people, Clara had her own bunk in a barracks with a roof that did not leak. The guilt was physical, a weight she carried in her chest that made breathing difficult sometimes. She tried to explain this to Margaret one evening as they sat outside watching the Kansas sunset paint the sky in colors too beautiful for a world this broken. "I feel like I am living a lie," Clara said quietly. "Every letter I write tells her I am well, and it is true, but it feels obscene. She should not have to know that I am better off as a prisoner than she is as a free woman." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "But would it be better if you lied, if you told her you were suffering when you were not?" "I don't know. Maybe she would feel less alone in her suffering. Or maybe," Margaret suggested, "knowing you are safe is the only good thing she has left to hold on to. Maybe your comfort, even if it seems unfair, is what keeps her going." Clara had no answer to that. She simply sat in the fading light and wondered if mercy could exist in a world this broken, or if what they were experiencing was just the temporary pause between one kind of suffering and another. In November 1945, 6 months after the war's official end, the repatriation orders began. The camp commander gathered all prisoners in the main yard and announced through the translator that they would begin returning to Germany in groups over the coming months. Priority would be given to those with verified family addresses in stable zones. The process would be orderly, documented, conducted under Red Cross supervision. The announcement should have been cause for celebration. Home, family, freedom. But the yard remained eerily quiet. Clara looked around at the faces of women she had lived alongside for 8 months and saw her own complicated emotions reflected back. Yes, they wanted to go home. But home was not the place they had left. Home was ruins and occupation and rationing and the slow work of rebuilding a nation that had destroyed itself. And for some women, those whose families had been in the eastern regions now under Soviet control, home might not be accessible at all. Clara's name appeared on the January transport list. She would leave in 6 weeks, travel by train to New York, board a ship to Bremen, and from there make her way to Hamburg however transport could be arranged. She wrote to her mother immediately, telling her the news. Her mother's reply arrived 3 weeks later, and for the first time in their correspondence, Clara heard something like joy in the words. "You are coming home. I can barely write through my tears. I have cleared a space for you in our corner of the cellar. It is not much, but it is yours. I have saved a blanket. I have been hoarding my ration cards to prepare a meal for your arrival, though I do not yet know what I will be able to buy. It does not matter. You will be here. That is everything. Come home, my daughter. Come home." Reading those words, Clara felt her throat tighten. Her mother was preparing for her return with the same care she had once prepared birthday celebrations and Christmas dinners. Except now the celebration would be held in a cellar, with rations saved from near starvation, in a city that barely existed. Her final weeks in Kansas passed in a blur of preparation and goodbye. The women being repatriated were given new clothing. Not much, but enough for the journey. Sturdy shoes, wool coats, simple dresses without the PW markings. They were also given Red Cross travel documents, official papers identifying them as repatriated prisoners of war entitled to assistance and transport. On her last evening, Clara sat in the administrative office finishing her final task, filing the letters she had helped translate over the past months. Sergeant Patterson, who had supervised her work, came in carrying a small box. "For the journey," he said in his careful German, "from the Red Cross." Inside was a care package, soap, a comb, chocolate bars, cigarettes for trading, and a small leather notebook. She stared at these items, overwhelmed by their simplicity and their value. "Thank you," she managed to say. He nodded. "You did good work here, Weber. You helped a lot of people stay connected to their families. That matters." It was the closest thing to praise she had received from any American authority, and it struck her how strange this moment was. An enemy soldier acknowledging the worth of her labor, treating her departure as if she were a colleague leaving a job rather than a prisoner being released. Diary entry. January 28, 1946. Tomorrow I leave. I have packed everything I own, which is very little. The notebook Sergeant Patterson gave me. The bundle of letters from Mama tied with string. A photograph of the women in my barracks that someone took with a camera we were allowed to borrow. I look at that photograph and barely recognize myself. My face is fuller than when I arrived. My eyes are less haunted. I am healthier leaving this prison than I was entering it. What does that say about the world? I have written my final letter to Mama telling her I am coming. By the time she receives it, I may already be in Germany. But I sent it anyway because I wanted her to know that every week I was here, I thought of her. I wanted her to know that the letters saved me as much as the food and shelter did. They reminded me I was still someone's daughter, still connected to something beyond these fences. The other women who are leaving, there are 47 of us on this transport, have packed their own small collections. We are not carrying much in our hands, but we carry so much more in our heads. We carry the memory of an enemy that fed us, of a system that allowed us to write to our families, of small mercies that made no sense against everything we had been taught. We carry guilt for surviving comfortably while our families suffered. We carry relief that it is over. We carry fear of what comes next. Tomorrow, we become refugees in our own country. The train journey to New York reversed the route she had taken 8 months earlier, except now she watched the landscape with different eyes. The cities, the farmland, the vast horizons no longer seemed alien. They were simply the geography of a country that had never known what Germany had known. Total destruction from the air. Cities reduced for the British Occupation Administration, using the English she had learned in Kansas. She continued writing letters, not to America, but to some of the women she had met in the camp. They wrote back, sharing their own stories of return, of rebuilding, of trying to make sense of what they had lived through. In 1950, she married a British civil servant and moved to London. Before she left Germany, she donated her collection of wartime letters, both the ones she had received from her mother and the ones her mother had received from her, to a historical archive in Hamburg. The curator who accepted them noted that they represented one of the most complete collections of POW family correspondence from the American camp system. Clara told him they represented something more than that. They represented proof that even in total war, connection could survive, that even between enemies, humanity could find a way through. She kept only one letter from the collection. The first one her mother had sent, written in desperation before knowing if her daughter lived. She carried it in her wallet for the rest of her life, the paper soft from handling, the ink faded but still legible. She died in 1989, a few months after the Berlin Wall fell. Among her possessions, her children found that letter, along with the leather notebook Sergeant Patterson had given her. The notebook's final entry, written decades after the war, read simply, "They gave us paper and told us to write." Such a small thing, paper and ink, but it saved us. Not from captivity, but from the silence that would have been worse than any prison. We rode our way across an ocean, across a war, across the space between who we had been and who we were becoming. Every word was a thread, and together those threads became a rope we could climb out of the darkness. I am grateful. I remain grateful. Not for the war, never for the war. But for the letters that proved we were still human, still daughters and to ash. Infrastructure shattered beyond recognition. At the port, the women boarded another ship. This one was less crowded than the crossing that had brought them to America. There were bunks instead of hammocks, meals served on actual plates, even access to the deck for fresh air. The crossing took 12 days, and every day Clara stood at the rail watching the ocean stretch endlessly in every direction, thinking about the letters that had crossed this same water. Millions of words on fragile paper, carried by ships and trains and volunteers, connecting people who war had separated. When the coast of Europe appeared through morning fog, some women wept. Others stood in silence. Clara felt only a strange numbness, as if the magnitude of return was too large for any single emotion to contain. Bremen was unrecognizable. Or rather, it was exactly what the letters had described, but seeing it was different from reading about it. Block after block of rubble. Buildings that were just facades with nothing behind them. Streets cleared just enough for foot traffic. People moving through the devastation like ghosts, their faces carrying the same hollowed expression she remembered from the final days of the war. The Red Cross helped arrange transport to Hamburg. Clara traveled in a truck with 7 other women, sitting on wooden benches in the back, watching destroyed Germany pass by the open rear gate. When they reached Hamburg, she knew the address her mother had given, the cellar beneath the former Hoffman pharmacy. She walked through streets she barely recognized, using landmarks that no longer existed to navigate by memory and hope. She found the building, or rather, the pile of rubble that had been a building, with a cleared entrance leading down to cellars beneath. She descended the steps, her heart beating so hard she could barely breathe. Her mother was sitting on an overturned crate, mending a shirt by candlelight. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then her mother stood, the shirt falling forgotten to the floor. "Clara?" Yes, Mama. I'm home. They held each other in that dim cellar, surrounded by other displaced people who politely looked away, giving them this moment of reunion in a space too small for privacy. Her mother felt smaller than Clara remembered, thinner, older, but alive, breathing, real. I got all your letters, her mother whispered. I kept them all. I kept yours too, Clara said. Every single one. Clara Weber lived in that cellar with her mother for 11 months, before they were assigned a small apartment in a reconstructed building. She found work as a secretary of mothers and sisters, still connected even when the world told us we were only enemies. The International Red Cross estimates that during World War II, it facilitated the delivery of over 120 million letters between prisoners of war and their families. Each letter represented someone reaching across violence toward love, across separation toward connection, across despair toward the fragile hope that words might bridge what weapons had torn apart. The system was not perfect. Millions of letters never arrived. Millions more arrived too late, addressed to people who had not survived. But for those letters that did make the journey, carried by volunteers, sorted in warehouses, delivered by postal workers who believed their task mattered, they became proof that even in humanity's darkest chapter, the desire to say, I am alive, I am thinking of you, could not be entirely destroyed. It began with paper and a pen, placed in the hands of women who had been told they were enemies, who discovered they were still daughters. And it changed everything.